Not So Easy Productions presents Michael's War, written and performed by Michael Brown, and dramatised in our Malvern studios.
Hi there, this is Michael Brown. It is January 2015 and my 80th birthday. My family have been getting on to me to make a record of my early life. I am doing this especially for my 4 lovely grandchildren, in order of birth: Sam, Emma, Aaron and Sophie. Now, this is by no means what you might call memoirs. It's just a hodgepodge of memories of the times. Recorded at my home of the last 40 years at 454 East Coast Road, Mairangi Bay, Auckland, New Zealand. So, let's get on with it. The first part of my story I shall call Michael's War. Now, my earliest memory of the war was on the 3rd of September 1939. The memory is there because of the dramatic way my father made us all, Mum, Dad, my sister Pat and I, sit down in silence and listen to the Prime Minister's declaration of war speech when he said,
"I am speaking to you from the Cabinet Room at 10 Downing Street. This morning, the British ambassador in Berlin handed the German government a final note stating that unless we heard from them by 11 o'clock that they were prepared at once to withdraw their troops from Poland, a state of war would exist between us. I have to tell you now that no such undertaking has been received, and that consequently this country is at war with Germany."
Now, after Neville Chamberlain made that speech, after the broadcast, the air raid warning sounded and everyone in our street started frantically filling sandbags to put up at the windows. We all thought we were going to be attacked immediately. No major attacks came for quite a few months after that. Of course, there were some air raids, but nothing too serious. This period was known as the Phony War. This was when Pat and I were evacuated for the first time. Now, Operation Pied Piper moved almost 2 million children out of London in 3 days. Now, this was a remarkable achievement. However, the only thing evacuation meant to me at 5 years old was being very frightened that I would be separated from Pat. I remember crying and crying for my mum and dad and being terrified I would never see them again.
The responsibility lies on the shoulders of one man. By his latest act of naked aggression, Hitler has committed a crime not only against Poland, but against the whole human race. Against the mothers and children leaving the cities of Britain under the great evacuation scheme with a smoothness and speed that avoids a single accident or delay. As they start out on what to them is the great adventure.
On evacuation day, we had to assemble in a large sports field at Sidcup. Each evacuee had to take boys: 1 vest, 1 pair of underpants, 1 pair of trousers, 2 pair of socks, handkerchiefs, 1 jersey. Girls: 1 vest, 1 pair of knickers, 1 petticoat, 2 pair of stockings, handkerchiefs, slip, 1 blouse, 1 cardigan, and both overcoat or mackintosh, nightwear, toilet gear and food for the journey. And underlined under all of this was, all must have gas masks. When it was time to say goodbye to our parents, Mum and Dad were both crying. I was screaming my head off, and Pat, who must have been just as upset as anyone, took me by the hand and led me on to the bus, which took us to the train station for Wales. This must have been a great burden on a 7-year-old, and I've always been grateful to Pat for the way she had looked after me. Mum called out, "Right soon, and look after Michael." Pat told me years later she had thought, who's going to look after me?
We'll meet again. Don't know where, don't know when, but I know we'll meet again some sunny day.
That was one hell of a long day. From Mottingham to Sidcup, bus to a London station, train to Wales, bus to the outlying village to our host family, to then be told we had to be very grateful. Each of us, apart from our little bundles, had food for the journey, a journey that in many cases took up to 10 hours. The little ones ate all they could in the first half hour, which of course made them sick. If you were lucky and had an adult assigned to the carriage, the adults spent most of their time holding kids' heads out of the window or mopping up vomit. The trains had no corridors, so we had to wait for the toilet until we reached the station. With the stop-start of the train, this would be quite a long time, mostly far too young for a lot of the children. Hence the horrible stink in every carriage that turned this journey into a nightmare. We arrived at the village hall tired, hungry, dirty and smelly. Most of us were still crying for our mums and dads, and after that horrible journey and ended up with the humiliation of being treated like cattle as we waited to be picked out and carried away by total strangers. As one of those who suffered the humiliation of not being picked, it is something I have never forgotten. And the little girl with me, who was also tired and hungry, and also messed herself, cried, "Doesn't anybody want me?" The people who took in evacuees were paid 8 shillings and 6pence per child per week. More importantly, they had our ration books. That would have been a great incentive to some families. There were many hundreds of wonderful families who would have taken in evacuees without any payment and treated them as their own children with love and care. These people were the majority. On the other hand, there were a few who sexually or physically abused the children. Then there were the ones who used the children as a means to make a few bob more with extra rations thrown in. They treated the needs of the kids with complete indifference. This last group was how Pat and I found it in Wales. It was the pits, forgive the pun. It was a mining village, and to be generous, all I can say is it was a mean house with mean food and mean people. Neither of us was at all happy in the land of song. After a few months, we were both moved to a hostel. I suppose the evacuation people decided we were not in the best place with this family. The hostel was fairly high up on a mountainside, and another great place to send children to be cared for away from their parents. It was the bugs I remember most of all. They were always there at bedtime between the dirty sheets. In the morning, my body would be covered in bites and scratches and scratched into bloody sores. At this place, we both got scabies and head lice. One day, out walking, trying to get away from the hostel, I slipped and lost my footing and fell over the cliff. Pat just managed to grab my hand and hold on. There was no one else around, so she had to drag me over the top of the cliff, with the cliff breaking away and a few hundred drop below. After all these years, we both still vividly remember the incident and the moment when she pulled me over the rim of the mountain. Thanks, Pat. After a few months, just after Christmas, luckily, a bomb dropped in the village. It must have been jettisoned by a bomber returning to Germany. This had the effect of Mum and Dad saying, if you're going to get killed there, you might just as well come home and we all get killed together. So, off back home to London we went, with scabies, head lice and big smiles, but back home to our Mum and Dad.
Chattanooga choo-choo, won't you choo-choo me home? Chattanooga choo-choo.
Another reason for us going home was with the two of us being evacuated, our house had a bedroom free. The registration officer for the area would call on all homes in the district, and any that had vacant bedrooms were allocated building workers who were being rushed in to build another ordnance factory in the vicinity of Woolwich Arsenal. If Mum and Dad had had someone billeted on them, we would have had to stay evacuated no matter what. As it turned out, 60% of evacuees returned home by January 1940, as the parents thought there was going to be no more bombing. Yeah, right. At the end of May 1940, I was sent to Farnborough Hospital in Kent, I think for tonsillitis. While I was in hospital, the Dunkirk evacuation took place. This evacuation was called Operation Dynamo, where the British Army was rescued from the beaches of Dunkirk by any means available. Ships and boats of all shapes and sizes left the shores of England to pick up as many as possible. I understand even rowing boats went to pick up one or two of the soldiers. In doing so, had to face artillery, tank and machine guns from the land and the Luftwaffe from the air. And there were lots of casualties from these brave civilians. Of the 338,226 troops saved, about 40% were wounded. And it felt like they were all in the same ward as me at Farnborough Hospital. There were thousands of them in all the wards and corridors and in any space available. Because the soldiers were always joking and singing, one day I stood up on my bed and sang to my favourite nurse, "Nursey, come over here and hold my hand. I feel awful blue. Nursey, when I am with you, my heart goes goo goo goo. Nursey, nursey, I'm getting worsey. What am I going to do?" There was a tremendous cheer from all the soldiers, many of them with horrendous wounds and many blind. That night I wet the bed, and in the morning I pleaded with my eyes for the nurse not to say anything in front of the soldiers. She knew. She said, "It's Monday, time to change your sheets." That was the first time I fell in love.
You must remember this. A kiss is still a kiss. A sigh is
Close to my 6th birthday was the start of the Blitz. Other areas of London had problems being near to strategic targets. Ours was the Woolwich Arsenal and Surrey Docks. My family was living at 9 Prestbury Square, Mottingham, South East London. The Luftwaffe had to fly over us en route to the Arsenal. In the back garden was an Anderson shelter. This consisted of some curved sheets of corrugated steel set into a small pit. The shelter was 4 feet 6 inches high by 6 feet square, with a small opening at one end. Most of these were customised by the owners to have bunk beds and wooden hinged door. This was covered by a blanket during the hours of darkness so as not to show a light to the German bombers. As at this time the whole of South London was up in flames, I cannot imagine that the light from our single candle shining through the cracks in the door would bring down the might of the Luftwaffe upon us.
And there go the Smiths to spend another night in their family shelter listening to the all-too-familiar concert. Chilly, uncomfortable, everybody getting temperamental. That one was a bit near, but there's no need for anyone to be so uncomfortable. You'll find in your letterbox a small official booklet which tells you how you can make your shelter much more comfortable.
The shelter was dug into the garden and covered with the earth it displaced. Because it had been put in a hole, every time it rained, the floor of the shelter filled with water. So all the things we had taken into the shelter, including our bedding, were soaked. It was not easy getting all this dried for the next night when we had to keep jumping into the shelter during the daylight raids. I say we had to dry everything, but as a 6-year-old, I had problems of my own. How to go to the toilet during the night without being caught by a German soldier in the dark. So I didn't bother. I just wet the bed. It couldn't be any worse than sloshing around on the floor of the shelter. These shelters were so dreadful, cramped and wet, that after a time we all took our chances and stayed in the house. Lighting was by candlelight, and for the toilet we had to wait for a lull in the bombing to either run outside into the garden or into the house. This was risky. The bombs may have stopped, but literally hundreds of guns were still firing and raining down shrapnel. I do remember my mum digging a hole in the back of the shelter into which she placed a tin cash box containing a few valuables. Carefully filling the hole, she placed a carpet over it and sat on a cushion on the carpet. No fiendish Hun was going to get her ration books and clothing coupons. Later on in the war, most houses had a brick shelter built. On the first night when the bombing started for real, my dad, who worked in the Woolwich Arsenal, came home early. That night, all 4 of us were in the shelter together. This was the start of the London Blitz. The first raid was of 1,000 plus bombers, and the further raids of a mass formation of bombers was to go on for 267 days and nights, almost 3 weeks without stopping. London was subjected to a massive bomb attack, the second Great Fire of London as it became known, 250 years after the first. The explosions came nearer and nearer until at last they reached us and the bombers were overhead. I remember terrified screams not only from our shelter but all the other shelters in our street, screams from the women and children every time bombs landed near us, which was very frequently. Everybody being thrown into heaps, side by side, by the concussion waves of explosions through the earth. Mum and Dad would lie on top of Pat and I to try and protect us from what seemed the inevitable. The bombing would go on for hours and hours. The thing is, this was not a one-off. This same scenario happened night after night after night for 37 weeks. And with always the same thought, is the next bomb going to kill me? Even during the day, I would feel like screaming to think what was going to happen that night. Looking back, I think my whole childhood was spent screaming, screaming, screaming. Now and again, in our infrequent lull in the bombing, we had to open the door of the shelter to get some fresh air. When we stood outside the shelter on that first night, the whole sky was aflame. Enormous flames reached up into the sky from the arsenal. Dad was crying because his 2 best friends, Shorty and Johnny, were on duty in the arsenal that night. We learned later that troops guarding the arsenal had received orders to shoot anyone trying to climb over the wall and escape. This was to prevent the enemy from knowing the extent of the damage. Later that evening, back in the shelter, the air raid warning went again and we took another pounding until the early hours of the morning. None of us could sleep. It was just catnapping through exhaustion and fear. After about 2 months of this, going to sleep in our beds and us kids being transferred to the shelter when the sirens went, sometimes without knowing it. But even with all this going on, we still found time to have a sing-song with our next door neighbours, the Everards, either in their shelter or they all pile into ours, just to lift our spirits.
Anytime you're Lambeth way, any evening, any day, you'll find us all doing the Lambeth walk. Every little
Sometimes
Lambeth
Mum would take a chance and stay in a house during an air raid, just so us kids could get some sleep. On one particular night, Dad was on night shift at the arsenal, and as only a few bombers came over, we stayed in the house. Then the raid became more intense, so Mum woke us up. As I was the more sleepy of the two, she wrapped me in a blanket and started to carry me down the stairs. As she got to the top landing, the raid was quite bad by now, the back door opened and a man in a steel helmet and greatcoat came into the house. Mum, thinking it was a German paratrooper, screamed and fell the whole length of the stairs, both of us banging on the stair rails on the way down. That woke me up. The man was Frank Brown from next door. He was on fire watch duty and had come to see that we were all right, as he knew Dad was working. He had the cheek to say, "It's a good job I came in when I did, with you having accidents like this. Silly old fool. If he hadn't opened the door in the first place, we wouldn't have fallen down the stairs." All through the war, we had a lovely dog called Laddie. He was just a mongrel, but very much part of the family. We knew when an air raid was coming because Laddie would sit and howl several times. Then he would go to the back door leading to the shelter. He would sit and scratch the door. He was always first in and last out of the shelter. No fear of an animal VC for our Laddie. Perhaps he thought he was doing his bit for the war effort by giving us about 10 minutes warning before the sirens sounded over London. Nearly 2,000 people were killed in London on that first night of the Blitz. And this message from Churchill:
"Little does he know the spirit of the British nation, or the tough fibre of the Londoner, whose forebears played a leading part in the establishment of parliamentary institutions, and who have been bred to value freedom far above their lives."
And a message from Nazi-controlled French radio: "All reports from London are agreed that the population is seized by fear. The Londoners have completely lost their self-control." Now, having said all that about the bombing was every child's worst nightmare, and it was, the daytimes were very different. Although still frightening in many ways, it was also very exciting for a small boy. This was also the time of the Battle of Britain, officially between the 10th of July and the 31st October 1940.
That was part one of Michael's War, written and performed by Michael Brown, and produced and edited by Tarquin Young in our Malvern studios.